AI is one of those things where there's absolutely no better solution anywhere in the world than Bitcoin. You can think about every single time that I do a GPT-4 or like some sort of more advanced model call as like every time I send that payment, I'm setting a graphics card on fire. You have to pass that cost along to the user, right? And there's no better solution for that than Lightning, especially because Lightning has this invoicing system which allows you to do a proof of payment. You're not getting in the way of the user experience for this stuff. And at the time that they're incurring the electricity cost, they're passing that cost along to the user. The way we sometimes talk about it at Fedi, right, is that we're like bringing like some of the oldest technology, which is like community, right, with like some of this newer freedom-focused technology, right? And so there's this interesting design space between first-party custody and third-party custody of what we call second-party custody. The Fedi Mint, the protocol, becomes a way of, starts with custodying Bitcoin and a way to scale Bitcoin where it's very privacy-focused and it's interoperable with Lightning, right? And then you recognize through the module system that you can have it do other things, right? You can make the Federation a password manager. You can like make a module that like gives hosted access to GPUs and all those kinds of things, right? I see a way that we can build this technology if we're backing it with Lightning payments, if we're using sort of privacy-focused things as it applies to these, where this can just like level up humanity.
Kody Low is the head of developer and product support at Fedi and is organizing the new AI For All Hackathon happening throughout the month of July. In our conversation, we explored the impact that AI will have on content, identity, and payments. We covered L402s and why Lightning payments are the best tool for AI companies. And then we got into the work Kody and his team are doing at Fedi. If you enjoyed this conversation and if you learned something new, the best way that you can show your support is by sending in sats over the Lightning Network. You can use any podcasting 2.0 app to do that. There are dozens of them out there, but my favorite one to use is Fountain. Before we get into today's show, just a quick message from our sponsors. Today's show is sponsored by Voltage. Voltage is the premier provider of Bitcoin and Lightning node infrastructure. Today's show is also sponsored by Stackwork. And Stackwork is a Lightning-powered transcription tool that takes the best of AIs and humans to create better, faster, and less expensive transcripts. We'll have more from Voltage and Stackwork later in the show. Kody, welcome to the show. Thank you for taking the time to chat about all things AI, Lightning, Fedi, Bitcoin. We have a lot to cover today, but before we do it, why don't we step back and just chat about your background first? Tell me about your life prior to Bitcoin and how you got into Bitcoin.
Cool. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah. And like long time listener of the podcast, right? So like real honor to be on. Like I've been here from the very beginning with you, like doing the first little fountain sense, right? It's been a big journey, right? So I was infantry officer in the Marine Corps, right? So like I still am. I do reserves, right? I'm like basically finished up with reserves, but I was an active duty infantry officer in the Marine Corps. And while I was on deployment, we have these very long tactical operations center watches, right? And so while you're there, you can't use your normal, you're in a classified space, so you can't use your normal computer, you can't use your normal phone, all those kinds of things. And so while we were there, COVID happened. And because COVID happened, like there was not a lot happening in terms of like while we were on these watches, right? So you had these 12-hour, 24-hour watches where you can't use your normal phone and stuff. And so it's kind of an exercise in like, what can I go look at, right? And so there's a couple things that I found while I was there that like led me down into the Bitcoin rabbit hole, especially on the development side, right? So the first one was I figured out you could go to bitcoin.org, right? And while I was there, like I'm very, very lucky that like one of the first pieces that I ended up reading about Bitcoin, like I think it was the first like formal piece about Bitcoin was the Bitcoin white paper, right? Is that bitcoin.org/bitcoin.pdf, right? Is that like, I was very, very lucky. And for me, when I first read the white paper, I just got it. And I got it kind of from the perspective of the energy expenditure aspect for it, where it was like, this is why Bitcoin makes sense. And then the next day I tried to read the Ethereum white paper, couldn't get access to it, tried to like read it outside of when I was not at the talk, right? Couldn't make head or tails of it. I was like, hey, maybe I'm just not smart enough to do this. Like in going down the rabbit hole, right? Like you end up realizing that like, oh no, Bitcoin is just this very simple, elegant innovation, right? And that's why it's important, right? And so the other aspect that I did was I figured out how to use Replit. And so Replit is an online coding environment. And so you're normally on these Windows computers, right? And while you're on the Windows computer, you're like stuck in PowerShell. It's very hard to learn how to code, all that kind of stuff. I decided to learn how to code because in the Marine Corps, we have this philosophy of every Marine or rifleman, right? So it's like, regardless of what you end up doing, you learn that job because insofar as you're in this organization, you exist to support the rifleman, right? So you have to know his job so you know how you can best support him. So coming into Bitcoin, like once I start going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole of like read the white paper, go like the rest of Bitcoin.org, right? I decide like I want to go work in Bitcoin, but I know that the most important in Bitcoin are the people in Bitcoin are the developers. And so as I go down there, I say, okay, well, I need to become a developer too, just so even if I do something else, I can end up supporting them, right? And so um, I try to learn how to code. While I'm learning how to code, it's like I'm using these Windows computers and it's like really, really difficult, right? I find Replit. Replit is an in-browser IDE and you can use it on like Internet Edge, which is like the only thing authorized on government computers, right? While you're using them. And so while I'm on these long watches in the talk during COVID, right, where there's like nothing happening, right? You've got like 12 hours, 24 hours at a time where you're just like basically sitting there waiting for the phone to ring so you can hop on birds and like fly wherever the crisis is, right? Is that like I'm teaching myself to code. And so after that, I come out, finish up active duty time, go back to school so I get more of like a formal education with it, right? And while I'm doing that, I'm continuing down the Bitcoin rabbit hole and like continue just doing like open source Lightning development, open source Bitcoin development, that sort of stuff, right? So that's kind of like how I arrived into Bitcoin.
That's very cool. Were there any other lessons that you picked up in the Marine Corps that you then applied to Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of them, right? So one of them is just like the clarifying statement. There's like two clarifying things of like if you don't really know what to do, right? Of that, like the first one is like it's not about you, it's about the Marines, right? And so just like generally speaking, when you're not sure what you should be working on or how you should approach the problem, just like start with it's not about me, right? So like get the ego out of the way and like continue with what you're doing. I find a lot of that in Bitcoin space, and it's super, super, super gratifying to like be surrounded by these people, and that's why it's like so cool to work in this space and like be surrounded by these devs where nobody puts their ego in the way of Bitcoin. They get that this is like a cathedral that we're building that's going to take hundreds of years, right? And so that's like a huge element of it, of just kind of like that this is more important than me, right? Kind of the other one for it is like when you're faced with incomplete information, right, is that you don't want to get into analysis paralysis. You just want to start moving, right? And I see a lot of that happening now in Bitcoin. Like when there's like this kind of meme that's like nothing happens in Bitcoin or whatever. But we've gotten to the point now where there's so many people trying different different things, exploring different design spaces within Bitcoin in terms of like Bitcoin script, in terms of like we'll talk about later, Fedi mints, in terms of like the design space between first party and third party custody, of being second party custody at different levels along there, right? In terms of like, okay, well, Lightning is going to be the like kind of waste layer of the hourglass where we're connecting everything between them, right? But like what happens at the lower level, what happens at the higher level, right? Like that sort of stuff's going to change. And so kind of we've got all these questions about Bitcoin and how it's going to be useful and how we apply things for these different things. And the solution to having all of that uncertainty is to start moving in the direction that looks best to you in order to acquire more information. And as you acquire more information, you refine the plan and you continue operating, right? That's kind of like the two things that like I first think of, right? Like it's kind of like the cypherpunk's write code ethos, you know, right? It's like we're going to write code to solve our problems, right? Of like if you're not sure what to do, just start writing code, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very helpful. I appreciate that. Okay, I want to start this conversation. We have a few different things to talk about today. We're going to go through AI stuff, Lightning stuff, and Fedi stuff. Let's start with AI, because I think this is like the hot topic on the internet recently, last, I guess in the last 6 months or so. But Bitcoiners, along with everyone else outside of Bitcoin, seem to have very mixed views on AI. There's some that say it's, the next great thing and we all need to be working on this. There's some that say it's going to cause the downfall of civilization, right? And everyone in the middle of that spectrum as well. I want to start with your views on AI. You've taken some time to look at this and build on this. Talk to me about your views on the AI ecosystem today.
Yeah. So the way I kind of, like I said, right, it's like you solve problems by writing code, right? It's like 70% solution and just continue operating and moving in that direction, right? Is that I kind of approach it the same way that I approach when people kind of have doubts about Bitcoin, right? It's like you sort of chuckle to yourself and you plug in more ASICs and you write more code, right? And like when it comes to the AI aspect of it, is that this stuff is open source now. There are sufficient numbers of people working on this. This train is not going to stop, right? We're going like next year, there's going to be open source models, which are just as good as GPT-4, right? Is that this train is not going to stop. So skate where the puck is going, right? And see if we can kind of like go in that direction instead of like having negotiations about where the puck currently is, right? So that's kind of like the general framework that I apply for this thing. So how does I like from working on the Bitcoin development side, how do I arrive at AI, right? So part of it was that basically Replit, which was my code editor of choice and like where I've been kind of doing this stuff, they did like a big focus on AI. And so I was like, okay, now I should start paying attention to this, right? But the way that I kind of think about it, right, is that a lot of the stuff that we do in Bitcoin, especially on the Lightning development side, is like when you're building for like the Western world, is that a lot of the stuff can feel kind of gimmicky, right? And it's not because it's not that it is gimmicky, right? But it's just like, hey, I could do this with dollars. I'm choosing to do it with Bitcoin. There's like certain things where it's like clearly Bitcoin like makes more sense than dollars, right? So like cross-border remittances and like streaming sats for payments and like doing for podcasts or doing like zaps and those kinds of things. But it's like, yeah, theoretically you could also do this with dollars. AI is one of those things where there's absolutely no better solution anywhere in the world than Bitcoin, and they have not solved their monetization problems for it. And so what does that mean, right? Like we've moved into this computing paradigm now with AI where you can think about API calls. So like when I go to a website and I start using the AI, that's no longer basically free, right? Is that beforehand, you could kind of amortize those costs, like the energy costs that you were expending across all of your user base, right? And so it's like, yeah, sure, 90% of my users don't pay. They use the free version, but they're monetized by the fact that I get those 10%, right, who pay me a lot of money, okay? But the problem becomes now is that you can think about every single time that I do a GPT-4 or like some sort of more advanced model call as like every time I send that payment, I'm setting a graphics card on fire, right? Like estimates for GPT-4 calls are somewhere between like 3 cents and 8 cents per call that you do, right? Sorry, for per conversation that you have, right? It's like you can't just open this stuff up to infinite for people. And so we're in this new computing paradigm, and when you think about it at first, people currently they're trying to use like Stripe for it, right? But it's like, okay, well now you've just limited your market to basically exclusively Western developers. For normally people who are going to be using computers or whatever, right? Like skate where the puck is going on this stuff. Where you've got millions of developers who are going to be coming from the rest of the world. They're primarily going to be coming from mobile. They're also not going to have access to dollars, right? Is like, what's a mechanism that you can use to allow them to build, to allow them to use your service as well, right? And this is where Bitcoin comes in, especially like the L402 standard, right? So you've talked about this before on your podcast, but just a summary in case people haven't heard of it, is that 402 is a reserved status code in the HTTP specification, right? Is that normally when you hit a web page and it doesn't exist, it'll come back with 404 not found, right? There's a 402 payment required error, right? That's a standardized part of the web. So L402 is that, hey, when I send back this 402 payment required, right, of saying like, oh, hey, you have to pay for this resource, I pass a Lightning invoice with that, right? And then the response is that you've paid the Lightning invoice and you provide the proof of payment, right? And so all of a sudden, this is like a clear match for Lightning, right? Of that, like when you're hitting an API endpoint, and the API endpoint is going to cost like 3 to 5 cents or 3 to 8 cents, like basically regardless of who uses it and when. You have to pass that cost along to the user, right? And there's no better solution for that than Lightning, especially because Lightning has this invoicing system which allows you to do a proof of payment, right? And it doesn't get in the way of the user flow, right? So I've been building a bunch of like chatbots and those kinds of things, right, that use Lightning on the back end. I'm getting paid in real time, and it's not getting in the way of the user experience, right? Because it's a live Lightning payment So that's kind of like the first part, right? Of that, like you have to be able to pass these costs along to the user. And then you see some of the development in agents, right? And so basically you can think about AI, like the big generative AI push that everyone's been doing right now is based off large language models, right? And so for that one it's like trained on like the entire compendium of human knowledge, tokenized and like represented as text. Basically from being trained on that, it can generate, just using like prediction, what the next parts of the text should be, right? So it's like based off of the entire compendium of human knowledge and some specific context that I give it. And then I ask a question. What is the most likely next token? So next word or next like couple letters or whatever to do that. And it becomes really, really effective, right? It's that basically you can have it speak to you, right? And it's very, very smart in the way that it does these things, right? So now the question becomes, okay, well, if we have multiples of these language models and we're having them output into each other, right? Well, now we can basically have something that acts as an autonomous agent, right? And so like, for example, the first pass that it can do when you ask it for something is it can split that task up into subtasks and then assign those to different things and say, oh, hey, the best way to solve this would be to use this code specific language model, right? And then feed that task into that one. And then it would say, oh, well, he's also asking about like, I don't know, like using Expedia or something, right? So it's like Expedia has been running a model and they have like specific context that's available to them. I'll use that one. And so you have like basically the first part of the large language model is like the like the scheduler, right? That kind of splits up the tasks and then it gives those off to other things. Well, now this is another place where clearly Lightning is like a perfect use case for this, right? Of that you basically give these agents that you're spawning Lightning wallets, right? And so it can purchase access to resources and stuff as it's working for you, right? And this is like even bigger brain off of this stuff. And this is like kind of like the thing that really gets me excited about this stuff is that you can also train the large language models that you're using to kind of recognize their limitations or even just explicitly tell them by passing them in the context window, right? So basically you can be interacting with one of these models or you can be interacting with an agent and as part of the context that you're feeding into it, right, you can say, tell it what its capabilities and limitations are. And if you ask it for something that it can't do, it can use the Bitcoin that you gave it to get a human to do that part of the task that it wasn't able to do, right? And then feed it back into itself and continue operating, right? So these are just a couple ideas that like really got me excited about like the applications for this. And all of these things cost money, right? Because in order to do like the best, most cutting edge stuff, it requires a lot of electricity, right? So like basically setting a graphics card on fire every time you do any of these things, right? And the best way to do that is to pass the cost along to the user at the time that they're doing it, not try to amortize it across everything else. Every single person building on AI is running into exactly this problem, and Bitcoin fixes this.
Very cool. I love that example you gave of, a language model receiving an input and then deciding to pass it on to different agents. And maybe the agents are human or machines. And it reminded me of value for value podcast splits where like someone can send in for this show, for example, I'm going to get your Fountain username or your node ID, and you're going to receive sats that listeners send in. Fountain's going to get 1%, Podcast Index gets 1%, I get some, you get some, like where every sat is funneled through this system. And I think that's the same as what you're describing here, where these AI models can now, they can pass along information to each other and compensate each other for the work they're doing. Is that roughly correct?
Yeah, precisely, right? And so what you're talking about there is a prism payment, right? It's kind of like the standard that we're trying to talk about it with now within Lightning, right? Is that like you hit the prism does the split, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a little bit different, right? Because you're kind of giving it to the agent and you're saying, hey, agent, one of your capabilities is that you have access to this Lightning wallet, right? And you can make payments up to this amount. And so when you do that, right, it can go off and like spawn more of itself, or it can spawn like different versions of itself, or it can go purchase access to resources so that it can run something more complicated than it's like individually capable of, right? But for all of this stuff, right, is that the more important part is that it's happening instantly, right? And this is why Lightning is the solution for this problem, right? Is because Lightning is an instant payment standard for this stuff. And so you're not getting in the way of the user experience for this stuff. And at the time that they're incurring the electricity cost, they're passing that cost along to the user, right? And so that's like the big idea here, right? Is that like we used to be in this place where it was kind of like, and this is why the fiat relationship made sense, right? Is that like we used to be able to get in these debt relationships where I could basically charge you at the end of the month for this thing, right? And the reason why was because I could kind of amortize that across everybody else, right? But now it's so expensive, and spam is so expensive for this stuff, right? Is that like the moment your GPT-4 key gets, your OpenAI API key gets compromised, right? Somebody's going to pick that thing up and they're going to spam it like to nobody's business, right? Like there's a huge problem with chargebacks everywhere else within here, right? So like, hey, my API key got compromised, or hey, this was a spammer who showed up at my site, recognized that I was using GPT-4 on the back end, and then used it in order to do like, I don't know, like generate content for like a model that they themselves were training, right? Or something like that. You can't, it's just so risky right now. It's going to be so expensive. People wake up the next day and it's like, oh, I have like $20,000 of expenses because like some dude figured out I was running the most recent models. And so he set my graphics card on fire, right? And so this is like, you got to pass this stuff along to the user at the time that they use it. You have to pass the expense to them, right?
That's really interesting because, chargebacks on the internet have been a thing for, I've heard of newsletter writers that, for example, have some of their biggest costs are chargebacks, but they've managed to get by typically because that's offset by all the people who don't, incur a chargeback. But is it just because of the magnitude of the payments and the speed at which they're happening, the speed at which all these costs are being incurred, that now chargebacks are no longer a sufficient user experience to have for the merchants,
Yep.
I guess.
Yeah. So
Interesting.
I spend $20,000 and buy 100,000 credit cards online. I use all of those to register for different AI services, right? And then I just spam those as much as I can, get as much out of them as I can. They're incurring this cost at the time that I use it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then when they try to charge me for it, right? Like I say, oh, hey, this was a fraudulent charge or whatever it was. That's a $35 chargeback for them, like as well, right? So it's like not only are they like getting the money called back, right? It's also cost $35, like for instance, that you're doing this, right? And so it's
Right.
just like what's great about this is because for Lightning, it's a bearer instrument and you're passing it, you're doing the payment in an irrevocable way, right? So again, you could do like a refund or whatever it is, right? But it's a push payment, right? So like I'm pushing the value to you at the time that I'm doing the service from you, right? And that's incredibly important for because you could like the paradigm to think in your head, right? Is that when you're using AI, API calls are no longer free, right? They used to be free. It used to be like, hey, I show up at the web page and like that's fine. I can have millions of people showing up on my web page because the cost associated with somebody just showing up on my web page is basically nothing, right? The cost
Right.
of training the model, you have to like for the cost for training the model, all that kind of stuff, you have to amortize that out eventually, right? But like once you have the completed model, think about it as like setting a graphics card on fire every time somebody asks GPT-4 like what is Bitcoin, right? You have to pass that along to the user at the time that they do it, right? Because if they figure out that you're not doing that, then they'll take advantage of it and they'll spam it and they'll just use it for other things that they're working on, right?
Mm-hmm. Now, how pervasive are AI models going to be on the internet? Like, are we at the point now where the internet we can safely say that moving forward, the internet is not going to be a free experience?
No, I think that there's going to be aspects of it which absolutely are, right? Like this monetization model, generally speaking, right, is that like, I mean, for the foreseeable future, right? I mean, well, I see a future where eventually everything, content and identity are going to be so ubiquitous, right? Like Paul Etoy from Stackwork likes to say, and he's been doing the best work on this, right? Is that content and identity are about to approach infinity, right? Of that you're going to be able to spin up thousands and thousands of agents with thousands and thousands of unique identities, right? They're going to
Mm-hmm.
be able to generate content. They're going to be able to generate images. They're going to be able to generate videos and writing and all those kinds of things. As that approaches infinity, I'm going to need something to gate my attention, right? Like 99% of the things that I'm going to look at are basically AI generated. Like people are already running into this issue in terms of training the diffusion models and stuff, right? And so the reason why is because there's
Mm-hmm.
so much AI generated art right now that when you include that in the trading set, it actually degrades the model that you're training on that AI generated art, right? So there's ways to do it where it's actually improves it, right? So for example, one of the things that people like to do is like you think about it as like a constitution AI, right? Of that like you the model gets an input, it makes an output. You feed both of those into there and say, this is what I'm trying to get the model to do. How would you rate the model as having achieved that thing, right? So there's ways that you can actually do this in a productive way, right? But the problem is that it's going to be so ubiquitous, right? I mean, there's going to be deep fakes everywhere. There's going to be like it's going to get crazy, right? Is that you need to gate your attention in some way, and when it comes to that, right? So it's like currently the way that we're in is that yeah, sure, you've got like the Web 2 or what, unlike the Web 2, Web 3 or whatever, right? But it's like you got like Web 2 where it's like API calls are free, right? And then you have this AI paradigm where you're going to have to pay in order to use the AI for these things. And eventually they're going to generate so much content and they're going to be so many agents or whatever, and you're basically not going to be able to distinguish between one or the other. The only way you're going to be able to distinguish for them is based off payments, right? Is kind of like a way to think about this.
So if you're gating content and identity, what are you not gating on the internet? What exists outside of that space?
That depends. Like, how can you define something as like besides its content and the number of people who are using it and the people
Right.
behind it, and stuff, right? And so it's just like because currently we're already getting this thing, right? So if you look at like people talk about them as like synths, right? They're like agents basically that are just these large language models that are just playing off each other that you're allowed to like autonomously just kind of like start operating. They just feed into each other, right? So it's like it starts with a prompt, it outputs itself, it like feeds those into a different thing, right? And then it kind of goes back and forth. People are already doing this, and there's already thousands and thousands and thousands of them, right? Like Twitter's been doing more about like spam prevention and stuff, but like eventually it's just gonna be so ubiquitous that people are just doing this all the time, right? Of that, like every single time that you post something, there's going to be someone who's going to be like replying back to you or whatever, right? Is like you're going to need like using one of these bots or one of these agents, right? Is that like you're going to need a way to gate your attention for these things, right? And there's like a bunch of different ways you could do it. You could do it with reputation. You could do it with making like a smaller social circle and stuff. Like that's kind of a lead into like where Fedi comes in and that sort of thing, right? But you're going to need a way to get your attention. One of the best ways to do that is just purely monetarily, right? Is that like for someone to get me to look at something, they pay me a micropayment, right? And then like if I find it valuable, then they get it back and they get more or whatever it is, right? But that's just like a way to do it. And like the question becomes, can we make this as ubiquitous as possible, right? And as easy as possible, right? Where like you don't really notice that it's happening. Like I know you've been using Albi for a long time. Albi with WebLN is just like a magical experience when it comes to using these chatbots and stuff that I've been working on, right? Is that like there's no friction between what the user is doing, but they're getting the cost of specifically the GPT-4 calls and like the more expensive API calls passed along to them at runtime, right?
Now, I have a question about all the biggest companies in AI today. So take OpenAI as an example because everyone's familiar with them. Why are they not using Lightning payments today? Because surely they see this same outcome you're describing where there's just like an infinite amount of content being created and they are probably running into the issues you're describing, about chargebacks, right? This is probably a huge issue for them. So why are they not already on Lightning?
Yeah, so so this is like a perfect setup, right, for like the hackathon that we're going to be running the next month, which is kind of the intersection of Bitcoin and AI, because like this vision that I'm talking about, right, where like Bitcoin is the solution to a lot of these problems. This is precisely what I've been doing. Like I've been going to all of these AI events because like I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. This is kind of where all of the AI development is happening, right? Is that like I've been going to all these things. I've been telling them this. I'm being like, hey, like Lightning solves this, all this kind of stuff. And a lot of them, their response is like, show me, right? And so that's why we have this hackathon that we're going to be running the next month, right? So it's called AI for All, and it's about using Bitcoin as a solution to a lot of these problems that we've identified with AI, right? And so the idea behind it is that like, okay, let's make a bunch of hackathon projects. Let's actually start like putting some seed money behind these guys, right? So like to have people actually using it, because when you're in meetings with these guys, a lot of them say like, yes, that sounds great in theory, but I want to see it, right? And so at the end of the hackathon, we're going to have a bunch of projects that have been using Bitcoin to solve these problems with Lightning, with AI, right? And so now when we go to these meetings with everybody and they say, oh, hey, we're having these chargeback problems and stuff. Well, here's like a Lightning-based marketplace for doing reinforcement learning with human feedback, right? Like here is a Lightning-based mechanism for taking your generated AI content through I don't know, like Midjourney or Stable Diffusion or like whatever like you're deciding to do or whatever, right? Like here's like a working marketplace for those things using Lightning or whatever. And so when people say show me, we have a suite of products and a suite of like projects that people are working on for this stuff, right? So that's kind of the idea.
Very cool. And now, do you think that imagining that Lightning, you build out the showcase of Lightning tools and show how Lightning is able to solve problems for AI companies, the next step there, do you think that we also see traditional SaaS businesses, the ones that have been able to amortize their costs and deal with chargebacks, do you think we then see them also say, maybe Lightning can solve our problems too?
Yes, and I think the reason why is because they're going to see it working and they're going to see that it solves the problem, right? Like this is the big thing when it comes to Bitcoin that like I mean I've learned of doing development on it, right? Of that like a lot of these things is just like when we say Bitcoin fixes this, right? Is that a lot of it we talk about like in the abstract, right? So when people, I don't know, like a lot of people like to say like, hey, Bitcoin fixes war or whatever, right? And like, the answer from a lot of people is just like, that doesn't really make sense to me. And like, show me, right? So like, show me a war that Bitcoin has stopped. And like, well, abstractly and theoretically, yes, eventually, like aligning people's economic incentives is like an incentive to lower war and all those kinds of things. That's like a multi-year project and all that kind of stuff, right? When it comes to this AI stuff, these are current monetization problems that everyone is facing within this industry. And there is no like established solution for. Everyone is in search of a solution, right? Like, so now is the place where we build this stuff and we say, hey, we've solved this problem, and then nail it and scale it, right? Of that, like, these are solutions to these problems, show it working, and then everybody else comes along afterward, right? Like, that's kind of like the model that I have in my head of the way that this works, right?
Yeah, 100%. I want to get your idea for how big this ecosystem of machine-to-machine payments is or will become in the context of the global economy. Like I'm trying to frame this opportunity here and think to myself, okay, if we decide that Lightning payments are the best solution for AI, what does that impact on a global scale? What are we talking about? Like a 0.1% of global economic activity, 1%, 10%?
Yeah, I'm gonna take a page out of Rusty's book here, right? So Rusty Russell, he's the lead maintainer of Core Lightning. He's worked on Linux development for a very, very long time. And one of the things that he said, because there's a lot of analogies between the growth of Linux and how Linux ended up winning to the development of Bitcoin and how Bitcoin will end up winning. And basically his big takeaway from it is that like the things that we think now are probably incorrect, right? And so in terms of like the percentages that you're going to apply to this, like I can see a bunch of different arguments for different opportunities. Let me just tell you where the puck is going on this thing, right? Is that content and identity are going to approach infinity, right? Is that we're going to be able to create agents that can create their own agents, right? And so when you do a task from your phone, or you put something down on a to-do list, or like you signal an intention from your phone, that's going to kick off tens, thousands, millions, hundreds of different processes, right? And based on the complexity of those processes, you're going to have to pay for them, right? And so now you think about when you talk about like 1% of GDP or those kinds of things, right? It's like, well, you know, if this gets to the point where we've got like thousands and thousands of different agents, everyone's got a personal agent, everyone's got like an agent that's operating at different levels. They've got like a personal agent which can recognize its capabilities, and then it farms it out to 700 different agents based on the complexity of the task, those kinds of things. There's a lot of different ways this to go. And so like, you know, but think about the more important thing, right, is that there's going to be machines operating all the time, and they need a mechanism to transfer value, and Lightning is the solution to that problem, right?
Do you expect the price to generate these kind of like AI outputs to continue to go down over time, to go up over time? What's your sense there?
So an existing model, the cost of doing that will go down, right? But there will always be frontier level things, right? Yep. And to do those frontier level things, to get the most out of the possibilities of this, you will have to pay money, right? So there will be free options eventually, right? Like just I think 2 days ago, right? So Replit released a code generation model, like a code focused large language model. And just a couple of days ago, somebody was able to get it running just on a CPU without even using a GPU, right? And so, yeah, so like the first couple of months, you needed a GPU in order to do it. Then it gets to the point that you can run it on a CPU. But by now, there have been new models that have come out, right? And in order to run those, you do need the GPUs, right? And so I think it's kind of a lead into like the Fedi, like federated aspect of this, right? Of that, you can think about like locally on your phone, you're going to have certain capabilities, right? And that's going to have access to all of your data and all of the things that just stay on the phone, right? And so when you can't solve the problem, given all of that, you can think about that agent or whatever model you're using on your phone being able to cascade up further and further away to more powerful compute resources. And the way I would like that to happen is not that you end up giving all of your data to these third-party people, right? The way I think that should happen, I think that that will happen, I'm seeing like stuff moving in this direction, is that as you cascade away from yourself, you're stripping out personally identifiable information, right? So it's like, yes, I'm solving the problem with the more powerful models that cost more, that are further away from me. But as I move further away from me, I'm stripping out my personal information, right? It's kind of the mental model to think about here, right? Because currently we're in this paradigm, same thing with like Bitcoin custody, right? Where it's like, yes, absolutely, self-custody is the best way to do this. Most people coming online right now are doing it through a third-party custodian and giving up all of their privacy, right? When it comes to these AI things, right? Like, yes, absolutely, running the thing locally on your computer is like the way to do it, and everybody should be doing these things. Most developers today who are over the next couple of years who are going to be coming along are going to be running on phones. They're going to be running on like, you know, old Androids and those kinds of stuff, right? They're not going to have access to the best resources just locally on their phone. They're going to have to go levels up, right? Currently, the way that that's being solved is give me all of your information, unveil all of your privacy, KYC with me, so we can use Stripe, right? Because that's basically the only monetization mechanism people have right now is like use Stripe, so credit card payments in order to do these payments and stuff, right? And so as you cascade away from yourself, you strip out the private, personally identifiable information, your private information. So you use the more powerful model and more of a general way of solving that task, and then you cascade it back down. Is a way to think about it in my head, right?
I see.
And so, yeah, and so this is like where we're kind of going to, and I'm really excited to see what stuff people build as they do this, especially when it comes to like Fedimint modules and Fedi mods, right? Because Fedimint as a second-party custody solution in a way that you can take custody of like your Bitcoin, your wealth, your data, and your digital life, right? Is the way to think about it. Is that like and these federation levels where it's trusted communities that you're that are kind of pooling resources and are pooling they're doing like second party custody, right? Is that at that level they could also be running more complex models and more advanced models and like amortizing the cost across just their community, right? And so you're not just trusting all of your data and trusting everything to a third party custodian, but it's more powerful than just what's running on your phone, right? Does that
I
make
see.
sense?
So Fedi can be that second. So if your first party is your phone or your hardware wallet, whatever, second party can be Fediment, some kind of shared community, and third party is the custodian or OpenAI or some other large service that takes all your information. Is
Yep,
that the idea?
exactly. Right. And as you're moving further and further away from yourself, you're opting into or opting out of levels of privacy depending on your personal, like basically your personal situation. Right. So, for example, one of the things that like I'm very excited about, right? So I'm almost done with this, right? Is like basically running a model from my phone, right? And then when it can recognize that it can't solve the task, then it goes and hits my server, right? But at the time that it does that, it strips out anything specifically as it applies to the phone, right? And so, for example, it takes the information and it like routes it such that you can't like trace it back to my phone or whatever, right? Like I think stuff like that is going to be very, very powerful as we continue on with this stuff, and that's what I'm really hoping that people start kind of building on and working toward as we do this. Because like when people talk about like the dystopian future of like, oh hey, like fiat, well, it's like AI and fiat and all those kinds of things or whatever. It's like, no, like I see a way that we can build this technology if we're backing it with lightning payments, if we're using sort of privacy focused things of as it applies for these, where this can just like level up humanity, right? It's going to be great. So I'm very excited for it.
I hope you're enjoying the show so far. Just a quick message from our sponsor, Voltage. Voltage empowers engineers to integrate Bitcoin and Lightning Network payments into their business stack with an enterprise-grade experience. The team at Voltage is building the complete toolset so that you can do more than simply spin up nodes, but also understand and interpret your node's data. Their new product, Surge, gives engineers the capability to quickly solve problems and optimize operations. With node insights and visibility through time series data, you get dynamic and complex insights never available before. You can get complete control with insanely fast onboarding, advanced client-side encryption, and zero management infrastructure, making backups, networking, and upgrades simple. Get a free 7-day trial today at voltage.cloud. Is there precedent for this second-party system that you're designing with Fedi in the internet already? Like what are some examples you can point to of like other instances where someone has used this second party approach with success?
Yeah, there's a couple elements for it that kind of differ it out in terms of making just generally the second party approach or whatever. Like the way I kind of think about it in terms of second party approach right now is basically, um, what's the best way to tackle this, right? And so like the problem right now for doing second party levels and second party approaches when it comes to the internet, right, is like the friction of payments, right? Is that if you want to do payments, if you want to like move to for that way, then like all of a sudden you're like, okay, well now I need to do credit card processing. Like the incentives for that become to go to a third party, right? But so like I think not specifically as it applies to the internet, right? But basically like the global south. And so within the West, you don't have these like same sort of high trust communities that you do down there, right? And so they're
Mm.
already doing stuff like pooling access to resources. Like for example, like Gridless is doing a ton of really good work of like setting up like bootstrapping grids around Bitcoin mining in different parts of the global south, right? And so for those ones, it's like, oh, hey, we've got like one place where you can charge your phone or one place where you can get access to a computer and those kinds of things. And you distribute the resources that you have there as you go across it. And you just kind of scale up that concept, right? Of that you've got like, okay, this local community that's very high trust that everybody kind of knows each other for these things. There's like a couple people who have access to these certain resources and they let other people within their community get access to it, right? And so that's kind of like the vision for where we're going for this stuff. Of you're saying like, what are like the current analogs for that one? I'll just generally say that because we don't have micropayments in order to coordinate and organize those tasking, right? And because like Fediment is like only just rolling out in terms of like the mainnet deployments and those kinds of things, right? Is that like we're going to see this and this is the direction that we're going. This is something that people have wanted to do for a very, very long time, right?
That's interesting. And so I guess even if we can even take a step back and look before the internet, and we could point to a lot of, and even today, a lot of high trust communities that exist in the analog world in the
Mm-hmm.
Western world, right? A lot of small towns you go into, everyone knows your name, everyone, they're all familiar with each other. Maybe not the case in a large city, but you go to a town with 300 people and everyone knows everyone, and there's some
Yeah.
kind of like social cohesion there. Um, similar to the
Yeah, the
second
way we
party approach, I
sometimes
guess.
talk about it at Fedi, right, is that we're like bringing like some of the oldest technology, which is like community, right, with like some of this newer freedom focused technology, right? And so there's this interesting design space between first party custody and third party custody of what we call second party custody, right? So, and that's like kind of where we play in, right? And so it applies to like custodying Bitcoin. That's when Fedimint originally grew out of, right, as like second party custody as a scaling technology for Bitcoin, right? But it grew out to much more than that because once you realize, oh, hey, we can do like threshold custody of Bitcoin, right? Well, you can also do threshold custody of data. You can also do threshold hosting of resources, right? By gaining access to it through like uh, by getting access to it. Okay, so there's like a lot of really cool opportunities there that we're exploring within Fedi.
Do you think all Bitcoin wallets are going to have a data component to them over time?
They already do, right? And
Or like
so
an identity component maybe, or some other, like
uh,
you have a clear distinction here. You have Bitcoin, and then you have like a community, or you have data or identity, whatever word you want to use. Every other Bitcoin wallet today is basically like, here's, you store your Bitcoin, you send and receive.
Yeah, I think that that's well when you think about when you say like, hey, you're storing your Bitcoin and you send and receive, right? So that's like, what are you actually doing? Is because like to know a private key is to own the Bitcoin. So when it says you're storing the Bitcoin, is you're storing a little piece of data, right?
Mm-hmm.
Depending on the size of your Bitcoin wallet, right? Like it can get bigger, it can smaller, right? It's like from the root, you can generate all sorts of fancy stuff. If you're doing like login with Lightning, for example, right? Like the way that that works is that you've kind of got a root secret, and then whenever you go to a website, it uses that root secret to make an ephemeral identity that only exists between you and that website that you can't trace across all these other things. What they're doing is data management, right? And so, like a couple things arise with that, right? And maybe we can move this over to talking about like first party, third party, and like second party custody as we do these things, right? So it's like first party, you taking custody of your own stuff. Absolutely. Like the best thing that you can do. It's the gold standard well, the Bitcoin standard, right? But like, that's like the way that we should move to. But now you think about, okay, well, I have taken self custody. My data and my Bitcoin only exist on my one phone, right? So it's like, what if I break my phone? So it's like, okay, well, now I have to think about backups. And so when we think about backups of your Bitcoin, right, the way that we normally recommend it is that you do some sort of threshold multisig, right? And so you've got services like Casa or like Unchained or just what people will roll themselves, and they'll say like maybe it's like a maybe it's like a 4 of 7 multisig or whatever, or a 2 of 3 multisig that I've set up, because in the event that I'm in an accident or in the event something happens to the place where I'm custodying my things, right, is that like I can't have it stolen from wherever. But at that point, you're trusting the other custodians as you go for these things. So the way that I think about it, right, is that any self custody solution resilient to you specifically having an accident implies a threshold recovery mechanism that can be made outside of yourself, right? And so it's at the time that you backed up your that you moved your cold storage to a threshold vault, which could be met in the event of like you having an accident or like, just something happens, right? The moment that you do that, you're trusting those people not to coordinate and communicate, but like coordinate against you. Okay. So any self custody solution resilient to you getting in an accident implies a threshold recovery mechanism that could be made outside of yourself. And so the way that people currently do that is either like, oh, hey, well, I'm just going to trust this guy, right? And it'll be like, Wallet of Satoshi, or it'll be whoever, right? And for that one, that's like, okay, well, now I'm just trusting them. But they're a third party, right? Maybe something happens or something like that. Like, let's leverage the fact that we have these high trust communities and that everybody, like within their local community, right, has this same problem, to formalize that relationship through the establishment of a federation. And now once you've set up the federation, okay, well, we're doing this just to custody the Bitcoin. Okay. What else can we do? Like we could do something like password management. We can gate access to like GPU resources, right? So like you have a gaming computer and like you want to like make sure that everybody in your community is able to like access the GPUs that you have running for it or whatever, right? Like that's something that you might end up putting inside of like a Fedimint module, right? But it starts
Interesting.
with Bitcoin, just as like, hey, the data that you're custodying at that point is just like the private key, right? And you think, okay, well, we're doing all of this formalized infrastructure in order to save this piece of data. What other data could we also do for this stuff? And how are there different ways that we could treat it, right? So instead of having like a single federation for everything that you do, right, you could have like a federation that you run between your family, between like your local like church community. Like I could go to the VA and I could like set one up there or whatever, right? is that like there's going to be different levels of federations for these things, and depending on the like data or the amount of money and those kinds of things that you want to do, you could store that stuff at different points along there. And now you have a mechanism where it's not just some third party, right? It's someone that you trust. It's someone that's close to you. It's someone that you're much more comfortable with. And in the event that something happens to you, for example, you have like a recovery mechanism for your kids, all like just out of the box, right?
Mm-hmm. So do you see this second party approach as a kind of gateway for folks to go from third party approaches, which is kind of how they've managed their internet experience for the last 2 decades, to a first party approach? Like this is like the first step someone might take? Because sometimes I feel like the Bitcoin enthusiasts will say to normal folks that are not interested in Bitcoin, you should self custody. And they go, whoa, I don't know what that means. I'm scared. I don't want to try. And so is this, in your view, a kind of like, here, take the first step, show you how to
Yeah.
kind of share custody, and then you can go branch off on your own when you're comfortable?
Yeah. So I think the way to think about this, right, is that you've got like first party on one side, third party on the other, and there's this design space of second party in between, right? And that design space is going to be different levels of federations. Okay. And so I think you're totally right in terms of like people being scared of the first party custody aspect for it, of like that's why they don't want to do it. But their solution right now is that if they don't feel comfortable doing that, then they go to third party, right? And
Right.
some people are
Yeah.
doing it just because they're scared, right? Other people do it because they believe in self custody and they've thought about it and they've gone through the thoughts of it, of just like, okay, well, I believe in this stuff, right? But I also, it's not that I don't trust me. I don't trust like my direct family to be able to do the recovery, for example. Like, for example, like my wife is completely uninterested in Bitcoin. Like she has no, like, she's like, Kody, you handle all of that or whatever. Right. And I'm like, as many times as I've like gone through like the drills of like, okay, this is like something happened to me. This is how you recover the coins. Right. Of that, like, as much as I'd love for her to like love Bitcoin as much as I do, right? She really doesn't. Right. And she doesn't want to be concerned with all of this data stuff. Okay. So it's like, yeah, sure. Like when I first buy my coins, I hide them in third party. I recognize that first party custody is the way to go. And so I move them into first party custody. And then you think through, well, okay, well now it's just me, right? And like something could happen to me. So like I need some sort of threshold backup mechanism as we go to these things. And so this is like a more technical podcast, so we can talk about this, right? Is that like, like Stump the Professor right now, is that in the event that I do have a threshold multi-sig backup situation, like what are two of the issues that come into this, right? One of them is that now just on a day-to-day spending cash, right, is like I don't have a good mechanism for that, right? Is that I need to get signatures. If I like really take it seriously and I do like a 4 of 7 or something like that, right? Then it's like, okay, and I'd want it to be Byzantine fault tolerant, right? And so I'd probably do like a 5 of 7 or whatever, right? But like so now I don't have a day-to-day spending mechanism. And so what a lot of people do is they'll do their whole cold storage setup, and then they'll be like, okay, but on a day-to-day basis, I just use wallets of Satoshi, right? so,
Mm-hmm.
but so that's like one element of it, is so you need some sort of mechanism in order to do like the day-to-day spending cash as well as also do this other one, right? But if they do that,
Right.
right? So, well, now I'm just doing the first party custody problem, like the problem that we just identified, but it just comes with my day-to-day spending cash. So like most of the coins are over here, right? But like as Bitcoin goes to infinity, right? Like that spending cash will also be very valuable as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what's cool, this is like something conceptual to think about with Fedimint, right? Is that Fedimint, you have this threshold backup mechanism, right? Through the Federation. But the thing on a day-to-day basis that you're using is the eCash notes, right? The eCash notes are single sig. And so you get the experience of using something like Wallet of Satoshi, right? But with this out of the box embedded threshold backup mechanism. So like this, like you can already do this on Fedi, right? Is that like a day-to-day experience that you use while you're using the app? Like when we were in BTC Prague and we did the pop-up federation, this is the experience everyone had there, where you could just sling sats around, right, through the eCash notes. But in the event that they lost their phone or whatever, they can go back to the Federation, recover their coins using their recovery material, or like we have like a social backup mechanism that we have in Fedi, right? Where the Federation can collude in order to like help you recover your coins specifically, right?
Mm. Yeah, I think that's important to. I know a lot of people who are hardcore Bitcoiners and still use something like Wallet of Satoshi, and
Yeah,
just because it's like a small amount of money, it's not really that meaningful at the moment. And Wallet of Satoshi, I believe, is the most popular wallet. I don't mean to say that there's only some people doing this. I think there's a lot. It's just like the most easy approach. And so if you can design that same user experience with backups built in, that's incredible.
yeah. Well,
Um,
that's the thing to think about, right? Is that like when people first move to self custody, right? they recognize this problem that you need to have some sort of threshold multisig mechanism, but there's no good way to do that with your day-to-day spending cash. And so
Mhm.
either they're just on one of these two poles right now, right? Where it's like either it exists on the phone, right? It's just a single sig on the phone. Maybe they have a backup mechanism or whatever, where they took like the backup of the key and they like put it in their house or something like that. Well, it's like, well, now anybody who recovers that key, they own your Bitcoin just as much as you do, right? But having like a formalized backup mechanism through Fedimint of the on-chain deposits when you deposit into the Federation, those are like the on-chain claims right there that require the multi-sig, right? But you
Mhm.
have the eCash claims against that, which is what you use on a day-to-day basis. And the eCash is interoperable with Lightning. So the experience is just like using Wallet of Satoshi. You're scanning Lightning invoices, you're presenting Lightning invoices, you're doing an instant payment as you do these things, right? But the eCash payment is single sig. And so you, from your phone, have the like great user experience of this thing. In the event that you lose your phone, you can do the recovery, right?
Yeah. Do you think the relationship between one's day-to-day cash that they might spend or day-to-day Bitcoin, sats, whatever, is going to be the same as it was offline, where you have maybe most of your money in a bank vault or stored away, you have small amounts of cash, but I mean, if you think about it in terms of like one's net worth, well, it depends on how much your net worth is, I guess, but the amount of cash you'd hold as day-to-day spending is very tiny. Is that same relationship going to hold true on the internet when there's a lot more things you can spend money on?
That's specifically what we think is going to happen, and that's why we're building Fedi the way that we are, right? And so, for example, within Fedi, right, Fedi is a unified front end for this, but the idea behind it is that you can connect to multiple federations, right? And so you'll have federations operating at different levels. And the way that you're describing it, right, is that like yes, you will have like the federation, which is just you and you're like your closest friends and those kind, or like your closest family that you're doing for like more of your reserves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then on like the day-to-day spending or whatever, right, maybe you have a federation that's operating at like a church group or like the VA or like the city level, or maybe you're at like a like we just did this in BTC Prague, right, is that we had a pop-up federation just for the conference, right? And so while you're there, right, you can have like a really clean experience of being able to interact with everybody else. You have very good privacy on that side of things because Fedimint uses the eCash system. And so while you're there, you do all that. And then when you're done, then you peg out of the Federation or you just do a payment out of it over Lightning, right? And so the
Right.
way that Fedi works, right, is that you can very seamlessly move money in between these different federations that you're doing it, right? And so the moment that like, oh, hey, I don't feel comfortable having like $1 million in my VA federation or whatever, it's like, okay, that's fine. Like sweep it down into cold storage, right? And like my cold storage for this one, right, is like a federation of just like my like closest family, the people that I would do with my threshold backup mechanism for my cold storage anyway, right?
Hmm. Does Fedi have any competitors today? Who do you think of as a competitor?
I We don't think of people as competitors. We think of like complementary different aspects of this ecosystem, right? And so it's basically like the place that we think is very interesting is this second party design space, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people are building a lot of really good self custody products. A lot of people are building a very good third party products, right? Fedi is kind of existing in this design space between the two of second party custody, right? Where it's recognizing that people have these trusted high trust communities and relationships and leveraging that fact and building off of that fact, the fact that like if you take self-custody to its logical conclusion, you arrive at some sort of threshold mechanism behind it, right? And so we're building in that space, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's like a lot of people over here, there's a lot of people over here, a lot of people in first party custody, a lot of people in third party custody, right? Like we're really focused on this second party custody aspect, right, of like leveraging the trusted relationship.
Are there any other Bitcoin startups that have said, "Hey, Fedi's doing something cool. Why don't we try and jump?" Like it seems like you guys are truly in a class in a segment of your own right now. And I'm trying to just piece together. Maybe it's just your first mover, or I'm not sure why, but it feels like you're in your own individual kind of like space.
Yeah, so on the Fedimint, so Fedimint is the protocol, Fedi is the company, right? Fedi is a company building on top of the Fedimint protocol. We've seen a couple other
Mm-hmm.
people who have been coming in and started building on the Fedimint protocol as well, like separate from Fedi, right? And so like that's super interesting as well. And I'm like having worked on Fedimint for like a year before I joined Fedi, right? As like that's very, very exciting, right? But and I just think generally in terms of the way that you're kind of framing it, right, is that it's like I think you first talked about it of like, oh, hey, like people are going to go from third party to second party, right? And like that was when we first started talking about Fedi, we talked about
Yeah.
that, right? Like that's kind of the same way that we think about it, right? Of that, it's like, hey, this is just a design space that is underserved right now in terms of there's these
Mm-hmm.
very high trust communities in the global south where people are not going to have the capacity, for example, to get, they're not going to have like the supply chains set up in order to get them hardware wallets, for example. You can't reliably get an untampered hardware wallet to like the middle of Nigeria, for example. It's like not
Mm-hmm.
possible, right? And so when you're talking about onboarding millions or billions of people onto Bitcoin, well, what's a mechanism for us to do this? Well, using Fedi, for example, so we've got like the Fedi order, which is going to be like these trusted community members all across the global south, and like in most of these high trust communities or whatever, who can help set up federations. Once you set up a federation, well, you can onboard everybody else in the community, and it only requires a certain like lower number of people versus having to orange pill every single one of them individually, right? And so, for example, when we set up the BTC Prague Federation, right, we had like the federation itself was set up, but then every single person who showed up at BTC Prague, they were able to join into it. And within the Fedimint protocol itself, there's no concept of a user. There's only the eCash nodes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just like a very cool scaling solution. And when Eric first started building Fedimint, he thought of it only as a scaling solution as it applies to Bitcoin, right? And a privacy solution as it applies to Bitcoin. Once you start thinking of it more generally of like, okay, well, to own Bitcoin is to own data, and this is a way of threshold backing up data and threshold custodying data. Well, you can also do other things with that, right? It's a way to think about it.
Mm. It's a really interesting approach to scaling, as you mentioned, but also just like onboarding and marketing. It's a very if you reach out to leaders of communities and then they can do the work of tapping into their community for you, it's like you have leverage on your marketing team or whatever term you want to use there. It's like you now have people who are going to market for you to bring on other people that you otherwise couldn't have reached.
Yeah.
And so it's like it's word of mouth on steroids. It's really cool, that kind of approach there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's very important about this too is just like for giving Bitcoiners a tool for onboarding other people, right? So for example, I think that you've run into this issue as well, right? Is that like you understand and appreciate the importance of self-custody. When people are first coming onto Bitcoin, right? Is that like going through the complexities of that, especially if they're like more technically minded, right? Is like a very, very big investment of time and effort on their part and your part, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
like now through Fedimint and through Fedi, is that you can have a federation set up, and then when you onboard the person of that federation, they out of the box have very good privacy, a threshold backup mechanism, and they're very close to you in terms of like your community for it, right? And because it's Lightning compatible, the moment that they're comfortable with self custody, they can just like move out, right? And so
Right.
that's kind of the big idea.
Now, I think you launched the Fedi Alpha about a month ago.
Mhm.
Are there any big lessons you've learned so far from the launch to date?
Um, yeah, I mean, like the most exciting part of it, right, was like one of the pop up federation that we did in BTC Prague, right? Because that was just everybody really, really enjoyed that, and that was like a really cool like use case and just like see it in public. That was like the first time we had like a large mainnet release, like we'd done a large mainnet federation that we were running on Fedi, so that was like super super cool to see all that work, right? One of the concepts behind it is that we've started working on is called Fedi mods. So there's Fedimint modules, which are extensions of the Fedimint protocol. So like normal Bitcoin transactions have inputs and outputs, right? And off of that structure, we can build all sorts of fancy, cool things, right? The structure for within Fedimint is that you've got inputs, outputs, and a single signature, which is a cross input signature aggregation across all the inputs, right? So this is like fancy cryptography that we would like to get into Bitcoin, right? Because it's much more data efficient to have like a single cross input signature aggregation for the transaction instead of individual signatures for every single one of the inputs, right? But based off of this structure within Fedimint, you can create Fedimint modules. And the Fedimint modules are, okay, well, like the out of the box, you get eCash, Lightning, Bitcoin, right? And so you can have the inputs be Bitcoin, the outputs be eCash. The inputs be Lightning, the outputs be Bitcoin, right? The input be Lightning, the output be eCash or whatever, right? Well, you can also do other things with that, right? You can use this module system to build off transactions where you say, okay, well, now the input is Lightning, the output is execution of a smart contract using simplicity, right? So we had a module that we built last year at BTC++ called Simpimint, right? Which was like the first use case of simplicity, which is the new scripting language that Blockstream has been working on for Bitcoin, right? Instead of normal Bitcoin script. You could have the input be eCash and the output be an agent that gets kicked off and runs on your federation in order to like accomplish some task that you specify or whatever, right? So Fedimint has this really, really, really cool module system where you can basically do cool stuff using the federation as sort of the consensus mechanism behind it, right? And so within Fedi, we have Fedi mods. Fedi mods, like they start off like our first glimpse of that within WebLN. Within Fedi Alpha is basically like just using WebLN, so like the web lightning standards that like you're probably familiar with that Albi uses, right? Of using them within the app. But also, this is where we're going with Fedi mods, is being able to get access to the resources that you're running within your community, right? And so, for example, when you're navigating through one of these Fedi mods, right, is that, okay, well, I recognize these are the Fedimint modules within the communities that you're operating within, right? Like, I will go try to solve this problem for you while I'm on this page using that instead of just running the local model or hitting like the third party, right? And so we've done a little bit of work toward that. It's very, very early, right? And we're hoping that people are going to start building on it during the hackathon that we're hosting this next month, right? But like that's something that I'm very, very excited about because we just got to the point where on the developer side of things, you can start building your own Fedi mods and you can start kind of tying it, not just from WebLN, but also tying it into the Fedimint system that you're running on, right?
Right. Okay. One more point on Fedi. You on your website use the term federated operating system, and when I think of operating system, I think when a lot of people do, they think they're iOS or they're Mac OS or Windows or something. What is the crossover point between Fedi and those other operating systems, if any?
Yeah, so you think about it by what it does, right? And so basically, like we started with, right, is that Fedimint, the protocol, becomes a way of, starts with custodying Bitcoin and a way to scale Bitcoin where it's very privacy focused and it's interoperable with Lightning, right? And then you recognize through the module system that you can have it do other things, right? You can make the federation a password manager. You can like make a module that like gives hosted access to GPUs and all those kinds of things, right? And so the way to think about it is that like basically at the operating system level of being able to orchestrate your money, your data, your digital life, generally speaking, between these different applications, right? Fedi is going to be a federated operating system of that. You can think about it as orchestrating your data and your money across all of these different federated resources, right? And so Fedi is the orchestration layer behind this, right? And so like I'm going to have Fedi, which is my unified app that I have for my phone, and I'll be able to access my multiple different federations and coordinate my resources and my money across those ones, right? And I can, when I go to a very public federation, like maybe I have a federation that's like, I'm operating in a country where I'm operating in a country where I'm part of a federation where, yes, this is like just what I'm doing for work. I don't need to do it for my personal life or whatever, right? Is that Fedi is going to be making sure that like as you're operating within that federation, you're using the Fedi mods over there or whatever, right? It's like not giving anything that's like private that you wouldn't want to put over there, right? And for example, for your like more closer federations, right? Like the family federations or those kinds of things, right? Maybe that's where it's putting the backups for the things as it relates to that stuff specifically, right? But Fedi is kind of like the orchestration layer, the operating system layer between organizing these different federations, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, I think in the Bitcoin community, we've seen a couple examples of things like iOS and Android being choke points for limiting access to Bitcoin apps. And sometimes it's apps not even related to, Bitcoin storage, but Damus, for example, and just being able to zap people and triggering a red flag from Apple. What's the solution here for Bitcoiners? Where do we go to get Bitcoin stuff through to the billions of people that want to use these things without Apple and Google, stepping in anytime they do something we don't like?
Yeah, well, like glad you asked because that is exactly what Fedi and Fedimint is solving for, right? And so the way you think about it, right, is that for Fedimint to work, it requires a trust assumption. You're requiring that the federation you trust them enough or that they're socially close to you enough that you can socially sanction them to not rug you, right? Is that like, hey, this is like a 4 of 7 multisig or a 3 of 4 multisig or whatever it is, right? That is the custodial aspect of it, right? And so because that has to be close to you in order to do that, that kind of sets a cap to the size of it, right? And so what a lot of people say is like, oh, hey, you can't have like a federated solution that scales to the whole world. And so what we say is that, yes, that's a benefit. right? It's because you don't want this federation to scale for the whole world. You don't want it to become a third-party custodian, right? You want to keep
Right.
it close enough to you that you can trust it, right? And so what Fedi's doing is saying, okay, there's going to be different degrees of trust across these different federations, and now let's manage your data and your resources and your Bitcoin across these different ones, right? And so it's like, as my work federation, as I get like more and more data in there, or as I like get paid in there or whatever, like I'll sweep it into something closer to myself, right? And then like as a federation becomes too big, well, okay, well now it's a third party custodian. It's not a second party custodian anymore, right? And so I sweep out of that federation into a different federation, something closer to me, right? And naturally, hopefully, we're going to see hundreds of thousands or millions of these different federations that spin up, right, in different contexts and capacities of anything where you've got like a trusted community, right?
Interesting. Now, I want to also touch on, you mentioned Fedi Mint, the protocol, and Fedi, the company. And you mentioned there's a couple other developers building on Fedi Mint. Can you highlight some of the experiences and ideas that people are building outside of Fedi, but on Fedi Mint?
Yeah, sure. So like within like the Fedi Mint development system, right? And so within Fedi Mint, like we've been kind of moving toward like kind of formalizing like the development process for it. And so it used to be kind of hard to set up these federations and all these kinds of things, right? But now we've gotten it very, very clean, right? Where basically, if you're a coder and you start building with it, you can basically start. So it's all written in Rust, right? And so you can basically start Fedimint daemon with default modules, and then you just add your own module below it, right? And so there were a couple cool hackathon projects, right? And so this was like Fedimint had a hackathon a little while ago. One of the things that they worked on was stability pools, right? And so stability pools is basically a way you think about it as like, because you're pooling access to these resources and these kinds of things, you have sufficient liquidity in order to start doing trading strategies if you wanted to do synthetic dollars, right? And so like I said a lot there, I went very fast. Like let's kind of talk about this for a sec, right? Is that if I can't hold dollars specifically, but I want to be pegged to the price of a dollar, what I can do is I can buy Bitcoin and simultaneously short it, right? And so for me to do that individually, that requires like a market trade, right? The pricing that I'm going to get on that to not like lose a bunch of money as I'm trying to like hedge the value of that, so they lock in the price of the dollar price of those assets, right? In order for me to get good execution of that, I need sufficient liquidity and size in order to get a market for it, right? And a market for this trade. And so
Right.
because you're operating these federations where you have like larger amounts of liquidity as it applies for these things, right? All of a sudden that becomes an interesting place where you can start applying some of these synthetic dollar strategies, right? And so you can use stability pools for synthetically pegging your Bitcoin to like whatever price you want, right? And so you could like, okay, we want to lock it into US dollars, or we want to lock it into, I don't know, like euros or something, right? And so what's really cool about this, so this was like something that was built outside of Fedimint, of like, so this is just Fedimint generally, right? And then for Fedi, like we're planning, like we're doing an integration for it. And so experience that you might have of using Fedi is just like a Lightning wallet, but the price denomination that you're operating in most of the time is just dollars, right? And so of course you can sweep to Bitcoin, all that kind of stuff. I know that you've seen Blink, the Bitcoin Beach wallet, right, from Galway, right?
Yep.
So kind of that experience where for them they're using their StableSat software, which is StableSats is because because they've got like a larger level of liquidity for that one. It's like they're using like a threshold multisig, which is like the custodian on the back of the Bitcoin bank, right? Because they can do these synthetic dollar trading strategies in order to give people a dollar denominated account within their wallet, right? And so because Fedimint has these like pooled resources, right, you can kind of do those same strategies. So that's a very exciting one that was built. Like I had no idea that it was coming along. Like I was doing Fedimint protocol development at the time, right? And it was just really cool to see that show up in the hackathon, right?
Very cool. So not only can you pool liquidity for this stability pool idea, but then you can also pool compute resources for AI. Is
Yeah,
that
well, that's
also?
what I'm very excited for, right? Basically, you've got all of these GPU farms set up, right? And so if I want to sell access to my GPU farm to like my local community or give them like preferential pricing or whatever it is, right? Is that like that's something I'm very excited for of that. I did like some preliminary work on it for making a Fedimint module that does it, where basically you've got access to a bunch of GPUs, right? And you just want to say like, okay, I want to give anybody in my community the ability to use these things, right? And then the Federation acts as the consensus layer mechanism for like making sure that their API keys that they're using for access to access it or whatever is distributed across the community. Is like you don't have any spammers and all that kind of thing, right? And so remember what I was talking about, right? With when it comes to these AI resources, is that you absolutely cannot let somebody spam you, right? Because like the moment that they can instantly incur all of these huge costs for you, right? And so like the Federation is a very good level of that because there's that level of trust within the community, right? And so you can say, hey, you're a trusted member of the community. I can give you access to these resources that I know you want to abuse, right? Or I can give you preferential access to it, or just like the people within the community want to give access to the local members of their community, right? Like they don't want to have to go sell it to a third party or whatever, right?
I hope you're enjoying the show so far. Just a quick message from our sponsor, Stackwork. Stackwork is a Lightning-powered platform for generating high-quality transcripts of all your audio or video content. They combine AI engines and hundreds of human workers all over the world who are paid over the Lightning Network to assemble these transcripts. And that's what lets Stackwork create better, faster, and less expensive transcripts. To see the results for yourself, you can check out my personal website where I host transcripts for all my podcast episodes. If you want to learn more about Stackwork, visit stackwork.com. That is STAK work.com. Okay, I want to finish this off with, we were talking about AI at the beginning, and you made a point about, there's a lot of dystopian views about how this might unfold, and you had some optimistic views. I want you to elaborate on that. I want you to help people kind of look around the corner of what's kind of coming down the pipeline, the optimistic view that you have of where the world might head with AI in its current form and looking forward.
Those are very, very big. Like the whole world, I don't know about that, right? Like I can tell you about like something I'm very, very excited about of that just kind of like a computing paradigm for this stuff, right? Is that like currently there is no monetization mechanism, like established monetization mechanism for AI, right? It is like in search of a solution for this stuff, okay? So we could go down the path that we did for the rest of the internet, right? That's probably not the best way to go. And it like doesn't work at scale, right? Because of the issues that we've identified in terms of like you're incurring these costs at the time that the user does it, right? And so you have to be able to pass that along to the user. It's very, very difficult to do with something like a credit card, right? Because of the chargebacks and because of the delayed payment, because of the fraud and all that kind of thing, right? And so the reason why people are going to start adopting Bitcoin as this is because of the instant payments aspect of it, right? So I'm a developer. I host a website. I want to pass along this cost to the user at the time they do it. The best way to do that is with Lightning, okay? It just so happens accidentally that as a sender on Lightning, you achieve almost perfect privacy, right? As the receiver on Lightning, I don't have very good privacy, right? Like I have to tell you where to send the payment, right? As the sender on Lightning, you achieve very, very good privacy. Okay. And so this is another one of these, like, I see you nodding as we kind of do this, right? Of that, like the reason why they're going to start using this is because of the instant payments aspect of it. It just so happens that those instant payments have very, very good privacy for the users, right? And so now when I set up a new website and I want to give access to like GPU resources or like use them as part of my website and those kinds of things, right? I don't have to collect all of their credit card information. I don't have to know what their names are. I don't have to know like how to get in contact with them for like a chargeback or whatever, right? It's like they can log in with Lightning. They're just a public key to me, and they're passing like doing me payments as they use my resource, right? So I'm very, very excited about that. This like Alex Gladstein likes to talk about this in terms of like Bitcoin being like a Trojan horse for freedom, right? Is that like people are going to adopt it because the number go up, but the like kind of like through the back door you get all this freedom text and that sort of thing. People are going to adopt Bitcoin as the payment standard for all of these AI stuff because of the instant payments aspect of it, right? But like as a user of one of these services that is offering me like AI services, right, is like now this is kind of like the cypherpunk ethos, right? Is that like privacy is not secrecy. Privacy is the ability to selectively reveal yourself as part of a transaction, right? Is that the base layer of the transaction is that I achieve very, very good privacy. You achieve nothing about me, no information about me except for the fact that I paid you, right? I can opt into different levels of that, right? Just for like user experience and those kinds of things, right? But like if we do this right, is that the base payments layer for using AI is going to be something where you get an instant micropayment, so it's better for the recipient, right? But also it's very private, right? Because it's a Lightning payment. And so for the user, they get a level of privacy that they didn't previously have. So just apply that to everything that happens on the web, right? That's kind of like the optimistic view that I have here of that, like, now the standard for these things, like the reason why people adopt it is because of the instant payment. but through the back door, your users get much better privacy.
Mm. I like that point you made. You referenced Alex Gladstein. Bitcoin is a Trojan horse for freedom. Is
Yeah.
AI one level above that? We can say AI is a Trojan horse for Bitcoin, which is a Trojan horse for freedom.
I think I don't know about the Trojan horse analogy as it applies to AI specifically, right? But it's like as it applies to the payments for AI,
But yeah,
right?
this is a
Is that like
very important reason to start using Bitcoin.
exactly
It's like,
right?
and so
Well,
maybe
this is
that
the
does.
thing. I was talking with a couple other Bitcoin and Lightning developers about this stuff, right? And it's just like when you talk about them, there's a bunch of stuff that people have been doing where it's kind of like like the way that we sort of think about it, right? Is that like Bitcoin is just money, right? And so like there's a lot of things that people do with money, which would be better if they did it with Bitcoin, right? And so there's been a lot of building like that. But it's like yes, theoretically you can do it with dollars, and people do it with dollars, and so we're kind of just building like a direct competitor for these things. Like
Mhm.
dollars have no mechanism for doing any of the stuff that we just talked about, right? Like
Right.
there's no chance that the agents are going to be using dollars in order to pay each other, right? Is like it's like you're going to spin up an ephemeral identity for an agent. It's going to exist for like 72 seconds as it goes and executes a task or whatever, right? Like you can't have a chargeback risk as associated with doing that, right? Like you
Mhm.
need to have a bearer instrument of lightning. You need to have an instant final settlement of these payments, right? And so this is one of those things where it's like, for me, it's a super, super exciting. It's kind of the same thing that I felt when I saw like the streaming stats for podcasts and stuff, right? Of like this is something where Bitcoin absolutely fixes it or doesn't require any changes to the base layer. The tech is ready
Mhm.
for it. Of like, what you've talked a lot on this podcast about like the limitations of Lightning and stuff or whatever. But like on the sender side privacy, Lightning is excellent. And so for users who want to use AI and do it in a private way, right? Doesn't require any changes to Lightning, right? Is that Lightning just becomes like a really cool, empowering layer for this stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm very excited about.
I am too. And I think you nailed it when you said that this is something new that the fiat system just simply cannot support this. And that is where I think a lot of the adoption is going to come from for Bitcoin and Lightning is where we have no other tools and we want to come up with a new experience. And
Yeah,
so, I'm very excited about you have made me more bullish on AI in the last hour and its opportunity for the world and for, accelerating Bitcoin adoption, because I really think that if it's so easy to get lulled into using the traditional tools that we already have. I think that's why banks and credit cards and stuff they were the first things people opted for on the internet, because you kind of could get by with them. It wasn't ideal, it wasn't perfect, but we figured it out and we managed to do it in a half decent way. You still can't make payments for like under $10 on the internet. You're not buying things for like 24 cents or anything. You can't do tiny stuff, but we managed and figured it out. But now here's this thing where it's so compute heavy, it's so expensive, and it's so instant that you can't use the existing rails. And so now the first time we're forced to like confront the issue head on and say
yeah,
we need a new solution. The old stuff doesn't work.
yeah. Let me tell you just like a brief story about this, right? And
Sure.
so like the way that you kind of framed that, right, of that it was, oh, there wasn't a monetization opportunity, and so we decided to go with Visa and credit cards and those kinds of things, right?
Well, just
It's
that
like,
that was already the traditional monetization of the analog world. That it was
yeah,
already there and they had already been built up.
well, let me no. Here's the thing, right? Is that originally it hadn't, right? As it applies to internet payments specifically, like there's basically no overlap, but I mean, like there's some tie-ins and all that kind of stuff. But conceptually, you can kind of think about like internet level payments as like very different than analog level payments that what people were doing with credit cards and stuff, right? And so, like, yeah, there's a digital bridge and all that kind of stuff. But let's kind of like step this back, right? Is that like the original monetization mechanism that they were trying to do with the release of Windows 95 was they had to deal with DigiCash, right? And so David Chaum, the inventor of Chaumian eCash, he was trying to close a deal where they would ship eCash with every single copy of Windows 95, right? And
Oh,
so
interesting.
if they had done that, all of a sudden the monetization standard, because they're like, hey, this is the digital payments thing, you just accidentally also get very, very good privacy, right? And so if that had shipped, if that deal had closed, if they had done that, well, then they wouldn't have had to go the credit card route, right? Like the original
Mm-hmm.
one they wanted to try to do is like, this is basically a digital native solution. It's not like internet native, right? But it's like digital native, right? Of it, they'd already built this out. That's what they're going to go with. They go with it for the speed of the payments, right? But you accidentally get the privacy. They couldn't land that, and so then they decided to go with the credit card payments, right? Well,
Mm-hmm.
now the credit cards come around and then the internet takes off. And so if you remember like internet commerce between like 2000 and 2010, right? And this is mostly like, I was like very young at this time, right? I think you were young too, but like, you can read a little about this history for it. Is that originally, before Visa built out its own infrastructure and acquired a couple other different companies for it, they were trying to close a deal with DigiCash, and they were going to use DigiCash for the online payments, right? And like they couldn't close that deal. But if that deal had closed, well, then doing Visa transactions, right, would have involved using DigiCash, would have been very, very good privacy on behalf of users, right? And so I see this same thing happening right now as it applies to AI. Is that like AI is this huge monetization problem, right? That just cannot be served by credit cards, right?
Right.
Cannot be served by the fiat system. Is that Bitcoin is a match made in heaven for this thing. And so like, like it's not about me, like we talked about at the beginning, right? Of like get the ego out of the way, right? And like make sure that we do this as like well as we can of like demonstrating that yes, Bitcoin solves its problems, and here's a bunch of ways that it's solving it. And for the hackathon that we're doing the next month, we're really excited to see all the projects that are going to be doing exactly this thing, because it's like the reason why they accept it is because you get the instant micropayment, right? You just accidentally also get privacy, right? You accidentally also use the best money that's ever been created through Bitcoin, right? Is that the reason why they're doing it is because they have this serious problem right now, right? But so just kind of like a little context on that one, right? Of that, it's like, we had these two opportunities for these payment layers of this new thing emerged where they had like software generally like run locally on the operating system, right? Where it could have been DigiCash. They had internet level payments, right? For like in Visa, the way they were going to solve that was with DigiCash, right? Or like a deal with David Chaum in order to use eCash for this stuff, right? Let's make sure that like we get the ego out of the way and that we're able to deploy this at scale, of that people are going to be able to use Bitcoin in order to do the instant micropayments, and then they backdoor in that like, hey, this is also the best money that's ever been created, right?
Well said. I like that. On a finishing note, let's do a quick rapid fire round. I do this at the end of every show. It's the lightning round. Are you ready?
Always.
Okay. You can only hold one asset for the next decade, and it cannot be Bitcoin. What asset is it?
Whatever can give me the broadest representation of GPUs. So currently, I think that's like NVIDIA, right? But it's
NVIDIA
like,
stock?
is that I think that we're going to build so many GPUs that it's going to boggle the mind, right?
Huh. Interesting. What is one book that has changed your view of the world?
There have been a lot of them, right? I think one that's like crazy good is which one should I narrow it down to? I think one, let me just talk about this one, right? So one is Gates of Fire, right? By Stephen Pressfield. It's his, you're nodding your head. I don't know if you read it, but
I've read, I think he has Art of War or War of Art. Which one is
yeah, he did War of Art, right? But
War of Art, yeah.
like his work that he does, right, is writing historical fiction, right? And so the one that he wrote there was the Battle of Thermopylae, when the 300 Spartans fought against the Persian army, right? Like at the Hot Gates. And it is just one of the best, like most beautifully written books ever, right? And so that was like one of the first ones where I read where I was like blown away by like the quality of the writing, right? But it's also kind of just like seeing the sort of ethos that he goes through. That like there's this very long quote about the role of the officer, right? And so like coming into the Marine Corps, like that was like a big one for me there, of like, what does it mean to be an officer? What's the difference between like leading guys versus being part of the guys, right? So like being in the group versus like, hey, I'm going to lead the group, right? And so there's a couple elements of that in terms of like the primary thing that you're trying to do is lead by example, right? And so like the most important thing that you can be doing is that when people are uncertain, being someone that they can look to and see, okay, this is what we do next, right? And kind of like being that prompt of like pushing people in that direction, and like just saying like, okay, there's a lot of uncertainty right here. So like, we're going to cut through this and start moving in a direction. That was like a huge thing for it, right? And it's been super helpful for me in terms of all sorts of different stuff, right? Because there's like a lot of, just like we were talking about before, right? It's like there's a big incentive for people to just kind of like bicker about like where the puck is, right? But then it's like, okay, well, like let's just go where the puck is going, right? And start moving in that direction, and then like rally people to kind of come behind you and start moving in that direction as well, right? Like that's a huge one, right? But like that's just an unbelievable book, right? Like that's one of those ones where if people haven't read it, like you should just like stop what you're doing, go read it, right?
Okay, well, that is my next question. If people have 1 hour and they can stop what they're doing, as soon as they listen to this podcast, they can stop and they can spend an hour playing with an AI tool. What is the first one you recommend they try?
I think the coolest ones for just if you only got the 1 hour or whatever is if you're not a coder, try to build a application using Replit and Ghostwriter, right? And so Replit is an in-browser IDE, and they've basically been doing the most in terms of integrating in AI tools, right? And they're pretty huge. They're collaborating with us for this hackathon that we're doing in the next month, right? Is that if you're not a coder, like the way that I think about it, right, is like we're talking about every Marine or rifleman, right? Is that like the culture I like in Bitcoin is this every Bitcoiner a developer, of like recognizing that the developers are the most important people within this industry. So also taking the time to kind of learn a little bit about what they do. It has never been easier to learn how to code, right? So it's like 2.5 years ago, I was just I was an infantry officer in the Marine Corps. I did not code. I was not technical, right? But like by using these tools and by coding a lot myself, just like teaching myself and kind of like trying to solve problems by writing code instead of like solve problems by like go read about it or something, right? You kind of get there better. And I can tell you that like I would have gone 100,000 times faster, right? If I'd had access to ChatGPT at the beginning versus only getting access to it like some of the last like 6 months or whatever. Like I've grown more as a developer in the last 6 months than I had the entire time previously, right? And the reason why is because now you don't have to know all of the underlying technicalities behind it, right? You just need to get really, really good at expressing yourself, right? And so, like the way to approach the problem of these AI tools is like it's getting to the point now where it used to be that the model was the problem. If you can't get the model to do what you want, you're the problem, right? Is the way to think about it, right? Is that the reason why this isn't doing what I want is not because it's incapable, but because I'm not doing something correctly, right? I'm not providing the prompt engineering that I need to. I haven't formally thought about this in such a way that I can clearly describe what I want, right? And so that's the one of just like go on ChatGPT, go to Replit, try to build something with Ghostwriter, and then Replit's just like a super easy environment to just get like a basic Python app running, right? That just like try to do something and like you'll blow yourself away with how fast and easy it is to like code up something that it's like this is a web page that does these 3 different things or whatever, right? But like going through that exercise and when you come into problems, right, is that think to yourself like the model is not the problem, I am the problem. Like how can I change what I'm doing in order to get it to do what I want, right?
I like it. And final question for you: who's one person in the Bitcoin, Lightning, or AI ecosystem that you'd like to give a shout out to for doing great work?
Nifty Nine, like Lisa Nugget, 100%, like single most important person like in my development as a developer, like ever, right? Like she is just like an absolute wizard as it comes to like building and writing things, right? But like one of the things that I'm most excited about that she's been working on is Base 58, right? And that's why I was like helping out with it for the beginning. I was part of her first class for it. Like I've been encouraging for this as long as I could, right? Is because she is like this unbelievable builder and unbelievable coder, but also very, very good at teaching, right? And so like I've learned an enormous amount from her. Like working with her has just been an absolute pleasure, right? And so like I think she like anything that we can get Lisa to do of like teaching, building, those kinds of things or whatever is like good for Bitcoin, and what's good for Bitcoin is good for everybody, right? So like huge shout out there.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've learned a lot from Lisa as well. I've had her on the podcast 2 times, and BTC++ was great. I saw you and Lisa there. Before you go, where can people go to learn more about you and kind of follow along with your journey?
Yeah, so the big one is that we're doing a giant hackathon next month. So like this is probably released right at the beginning of it, right? So for the month of July.
So the hackathon's for July.
Yeah. Yes. So we're doing a hackathon. It's going to be focused on this intersection between AI and Bitcoin. It's called AI for All, right? And so little link in the description for that one, but just sign up for that, start building on it. We're going to have tons of people mentoring, even if you don't know how to code, right? It's like using these AI tools, like you can build something really, really cool, right? And so we want to see that happen. We want to like help you out with that. So go there. Then Fedi is fedi.xyz, right? That's just the website for it. And then like we're also going to be very active as part of when you're in the hackathon. We'll be doing some Fedi stuff in terms of like Fedi mods, how to build a Fedi Mint module, like some of the intersections between those ones and stuff, right? And then I'm at Kody Low on Twitter, but like I mostly am going to be for the next month at least, and probably the foreseeable future after that. Like I will be in just various dev circles, building stuff and helping other people build stuff, right? So definitely participate in the hackathon. Start building, like I said, right, is that I really like this culture. It's like starting to emerge within Bitcoin of like every Bitcoiner a developer, right? And like AI is a really powerful tool for making that possible, because a lot of people, they think of themselves as not technical, but they're just not technical yet, and they don't need to be as technical as they need it to be because they can be assisted by a bunch of these AI models, right?
Very cool. It's a great note to end the show. Thank you again for taking the time, and I hope we can do it again soon.
Totally. Thanks.
In the last 30 days, you guys sent in 60,730 sats, and that came in from 31 different supporters. testing a brand new dashboard from Fountain right now. It looks very sleek. Let's run through some of the comments you guys sent in the last week or so. We have a cheers emoji and 250 sats on episode 111 with Graham Krizik. Blockchain Boog sent in 5,000 sats and said, great interview. Still waiting for that ClearNet node voltage on the same episode 111. Michael Machulev sent in a lightning emoji, sent in 500 sats on that same episode. An anonymous user sent 500 sats on episode 102 with Nick Slaney and said, love this episode and your work. And then we had a user who commented smiles on one of the clips about earning Bitcoin for walking. That's all the comments in the last week or so. Thank you again for everyone who's been supporting the show, sending in sats, sending in comments. It means a lot. And I can't wait to see what you guys send in this week.